We're going to cover a wide variety of stuff today. The BRC is going to be our foundation. We're not going to sit here and read the BRC to y'all. The idea is we're going to take some of the concepts and the foundations in there and use them as a basis to explore a lot of what's going on. And what's going on is changing so much. We were iterating over email every day the last 3 to 4 days on, well, hey, now we need to cover this. Oh, well, wait, this changed. Okay, now this is going to take its place. And, you know, I think that's just what we're going to expect in the coming weeks, months, and years. That pace, that change in the slope of the evolution is not going to change. So I want to start, this is not a trick question, but I really want to know because it's going to help us gauge what we cover today. How many of y'all have read or are relatively familiar with the BRC on technology governance? Show of hands. Okay, great. We're going to incorporate that into what we cover and how deep, how broad we go today. And we will be in about 45 minutes-ish moving into a Q&A. So as questions come to your mind, use that QR code on the table. I'm going to have the questions here. And, you know, a $5 bill or even a 20 will help get your question to the front of the queue. Jen is going to be up here keeping track, and, you know, she'll be ranking the questions. So I'm going to start with, there was a quote in the BRC that's being used a lot, and it's being used a lot because it does capture where we are right now, and it captures the paradox that we as board directors need to be taking into account in our oversight. And that quote is, the biggest risk right now is not taking one. And you can see the paradox that's inherent in that. And that's going to actually frame a lot of what we chat about today. We want to cover some tactical takeaways you can leave with. We want to get a little bit, you know, philosophical and deep on a couple of things, maybe hopefully make you think a little bit, maybe think about how some of what we're going to cover is going to apply to the companies that you serve. And I want to touch on the fact that we are absolutely, before too many minutes go by, we are going to talk about that mic drop that happened not very long ago called DeepSeek. So, you know, don't worry. Going to be talking quite a bit about that in a couple of minutes, as a matter of fact. So to just lay a couple of foundations, using the BRC as our guide, I already mentioned that one of the main focus areas of the BRC was how much the pace of technology evolution has changed. Technology evolution has been a theme for decades, but that slope and that exponential curve has really changed and is continuing to change. So, you know, Ryan, as one of the commissioners for the BRC this past year, I'd like for you to level set us a little bit and talk about how do the directors in the audience need to think about looking where that puck is going and how they need to act or react in response to that puck's trajectory.
Sure. So delighted to be with you all today. Thanks very much to the chapter for the invitation. To address Joanna's questions, a couple of things to just frame this up. One of the other quotes that I'll start with, which I think is right early in the BRC, is a question that we asked ourselves. Why this, why now? Right? Because the data has actually been very consistent for the last at least 15 years that organizations across industries that lead with technology, that transform their business models with technology, win, and they win in a very significant way. So that in and of itself really isn't new. The acceleration, the speed, this AI wave, I think is what's put a lot of organizations and finally leaders sort of over the hump of saying we need to figure this out. And so I think the BRC was very timely. Everybody's, of course, consumed with all things AI and justifiably so because we know what these patterns look like. You win in a pretty significant way if you get this right, and you fall behind very, very quickly and arguably faster and faster if you sort of ignore what's happening with these developments. And we can come into some of those data points in a little bit. In terms of the BRC, I'd recommend that you read through it. There's great tools for boards, including charters for science and technology committees. We can talk about that in a bit. But the main sort of idea that I would encourage you to take away is that this needs to be a regular conversation with your boards. Whether you create a new structure on your boards or not, whether it's in the full board, but there's been a tendency for the last period of time for board directors to say, we don't have time for this, we're too busy with all of the other sorts of things. And arguably that is just it's our responsibility as board directors to find the time. I mean, we are the board, we own the schedules, we can carve out the kinds of time that we need. And what we do at that time is very important. What are we doing today with the organization? Obviously, what are all of the emerging risks? But who is responsible in the organization for looking at what's next and translating that? What have we learned over the last quarter? Those kinds of things. So it's really a forward-looking as opposed to a backward-looking review. It's much more active, much more dynamic, and it's just in response to the really incredible acceleration that we're all seeing. And I'll make one final point on this. As directors, we are learning about this at the exact same time that the management teams are. Right? There's nobody who's an expert in what's happening in 6 months from now. Right? And so it gives another sort of opportunity for boards to make sure that we're having the right conversation, because we can't necessarily trust that the people who are up to their eyeballs operating organizations are necessarily able to follow everything as quickly as it's happening. Hopefully they are, but it's, again, I think another opportunity for governance.
Absolutely, yeah. Rob, I'd like for you to frame a little bit for the audience. What do you think they're actually going to see possible in the next 12 to 18 months? We talk about, oh my gosh, the pace of change. What's that actually going to look like on the ground?
Well, thank you for the kind invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you all. I think that my perspective is I come from the national security apparatus, if you will, so I have that bias built in, and so my apologies in advance. But I think that there's one thing that came up last night in our conversation that really struck me, and it was a combination of what both of you said. It was the idea that one thing that we can control is our own cognitive readiness, that we can control where we are in terms of our learning curve, where we are in terms of our knowledge and our capabilities. We can't control where the tech is. And to be honest, the technologists can't really control that either. To Ryan's point last night, large language models and generative AI were mostly the result of Forrest Gumping our way through technology. It really wasn't a plan. If you were going to look at where, say, the government was making big bets on AI, it would never have been Transformers. We weren't putting money into Transformers. And that's the technology that took off and created these lifelike bots. We didn't predict that. It just occurred. So given that that's sort of the state of pace, the way to manage that is to manage what we're learning, our experiences, and our interaction with that technology. I have no idea if I answered your question, but it felt like a pretty good riff, right? So
I think you gave us a really good way to frame it. And I would like to underscore there is an element that we can control to a degree, which is our learning, where we go for information, how we engage with others to have that conversation. And then there's always, we are approaching deep seat conversation time up here. There is always going to be that element of, oh wow, something pigeons in out of the sky, right? Ryan, you mentioned something last night as well that I'd love the audience to hear your thoughts on, which is how you see the long tail of the impact to a lot of companies' value props and their mission of this.
So if we're talking about generative AI in particular, the most important thing to understand is why is this so powerful? What's the atomic unit of change here? And in a nutshell, we've never had technology that can create before. It's never happened. It's all been about automation and operationalization and analytics and those kinds of things. So this is a fundamentally new data capability that has simply never existed before. So if you have a little bit of whiplash from the speed of it, it's because this is actually part of what the technology does. It accelerates, it creates, and we've just never had to manage anything like it before, as Rob said. By the way, I don't think you're that scary, but
thank you. I appreciate that.
But it's just it's entirely new. And so with that said, if we look historically at what's happened with some of the previous big wave technology changes, we've seen, for example, marginal cost of distribution in terms of content and software and those kinds of things go down to zero. We've seen marginal cost of compute go down to zero. And so the big question is, what might the marginal cost implications of something like Gen AI become? And the most logical way to frame it is we expect the marginal cost of innovation to go down to zero. Right? Great response. That's exactly it. And so how do we work that in, right? How do we work that in over time? And by the way, keep in mind, we're at day one of a 10-year of a 10-year journey. But looking at the economics of how these major platform shifts occur is actually really instructive. We already know, and there was a piece of research done by S&P looking at companies that were investing at a transformational level in AI between 2022 and 23. And they were already seeing approximately 90% productivity advantages over their competitors across basically every functional area in the enterprise. Wow. And that's with off-the-shelf tech. By the way, that's exactly the kind of stuff that we saw with other technology waves. So again, there's patterns that we can recognize. But the thing that's different is this idea of innovation, business model evolution, new value propositions. That's always where winners and losers start to shake out. Everybody sort of figures their way to the automation and the productivity over time. That's obvious. The trick is, how do we actually turn this into new value creation? And that's, I think, the big strategic challenge that organizations have.
And I'm guessing, Ryan, we've got a mix of companies and verticals out here in the audience. I'm going to make the guess that some of these companies, they have a huge opportunity in front to invest more in innovation and reap those benefits. There's probably also a fair amount of companies represented here today that are going to have significant possible loss on the horizon if they're not thinking about how this shrinking in the margins is going to actually affect what they do and how they make money.
So I think as directors, one of the things that's always very useful is to put this technology discussion into economic and financial performance terms, because that's where the rubber hits the road, right? And so understanding the impacts, framing it that way gets everybody on the same page, and we can talk about not necessarily technology developments, which can be sort of all over the place, but we can talk about the economic impact of these changes. Again, it's been the case historically, depending on the sector, depending on the tech, that there have been margin pressures that naturally come in by virtue of the different compute that's sort of the order of the day. The thing that's different about this Gen AI wave is that it's every functional area, every industry, very, very quickly. And it's also tricky because we have to get our heads around the fact that we can do things we've never been able to do before. So as executives and board directors, if we're only focused on productivity, if we're only focused on sort of enhancing the current operations, then we are by definition missing a trick. You don't have to have an answer tomorrow. We need to be asking the questions though, right? Who's responsible in the management team for asking these provocative questions, looking at the entirely new sort of sectors of competition? Every sector has disruptors coming in. I don't like the term, but there you go. Every sector has massive venture capital investment coming in, and it's just moving faster and faster. And then of course there's subdomains, there's a complexity to it, but if we don't start instrumenting it explicitly and then having those regular conversations, again, the risk is that we miss it.
I think that's a really excellent takeaway, what you said a moment ago about taking the technology conversation into economic and financial terms. I love that as a takeaway because so many conversations, with my technology background, I'm often currently still the tech person on the board, right? And that's going to change over time. We know that. But currently that is the state for a lot of companies. And therefore the conversations about technology end up being more abstract. They end up just kind of being, oh, let's talk about the tech, instead of let's talk about the so what from the tech. How do we make money today? How is that way of making money potentially going to grow or shrink based on technology changes, and then start to predicate your business strategy around that fact, not just the technology itself. It is just a tool at the end of the day, after all. That's an excellent takeaway. We're going to talk about DeepSeek. I'm guessing most people have heard about this. This was a bit of a mic drop moment, not by coincidence either. I mean, please try to convince me that the $500 billion announcement of Stargate, closely followed by publicity around DeepSeek, which had actually already been available, just hadn't gotten a lot of attention in press, was a coincidence. It absolutely was not. And at first glance, at first it's like, well, what's not to like? 30 claims of being 30 times cheaper to actually run, open source, so people can really get down in the guts and they can even edit it to meet their needs, and I could go on. Sounded great. We know as each day has gone by, there's way more to the story. And there's a lot of nuance around these claims, if not just outright, some of them being declared false now. Rob, I'm going to start with you, because let's just jump into the security and political and national security implications of this. I'd love to hear your thoughts on both, how this is just really part of a traditional playbook, regardless of what the tools are, but then your specific thoughts around DeepSeek.
Sure. Well, thank you. This is not dissimilar from other espionage operations that China has run. The MSS, their security service, is particularly good at a number of operations. Tech operations is one of their fortes. This has been on their. To put this in context, there's an argument about DeepSeek that it costs $6 million to create this model, and that they compare that $6 million to what OpenAI has spent. The reality, though, is that the infrastructure to create that model, yes, it was borrowed from OpenAI, which doesn't make me sad, because OpenAI borrowed content from everybody on the planet.
Everyone else too.
So we're stealing from thieves. Okay. It does trouble me, though, that they've hidden the fact that they are using existing infrastructure from ByteDance and their platforms, and they're co-located in Malaysia with energy, actually with production facilities for energy, YTL. YTL, thank you, yeah. YTL, and that there is a giant investment. I was getting things on my Signal app, pictures from server farms in Shenzhen with H100 servers. And so it's not as if the tech isn't there. Our sanctions and our prohibitions and our regulation around the tech is not working. It's too easy to get your hands on it through a third party these days. And so that's behind the story is that number is probably multitudes of that. I mean, it's 6 million is not real. What they have done, though, is through the 1,000 Talents program, China's been able to attract a ton of talent. And they've gone on the offensive when it's talent time. They've come to the States with the Confucius Institutes, which are now mostly gone. But there was a very strong effort to recruit nationally for Chinese companies to move their families. I know a number of professors who left professorial gigs for $1 million contracts in China. It would be hard to say no. So that's sort of right out of their playbook, is let's go get the talent, let's use the diaspora to collect, let's advance on tech, so rather than building landlines, we'll just jump into cell phones, so that metaphor of let's just leapfrog existing, we'll steal from OpenAI, because who cares, and here we are.
And then steal from anybody who puts their data into the engine.
Yes.
Yes, and that's the risk, there are ways to get this onto your machine so it's not talking to the world. Don't count on them. So my recommendation is stay away. It is, unless you want all of your personal data and or corporate data to leak out into the universe.
And we're actually, I do want to mention the so-called deep leak find that a cybersecurity company found recently. Before we get to that, Ryan, you had an interesting initial reaction to DeepSeek. And I'd love for you to elaborate a little bit on that to the audience, because you were not surprised at all.
No, I think that this follows a pattern. It follows not only a pattern as Rob described in terms of some of the PSYOPs and things like that, but it follows some of the more sort of technology evolution patterns that we can pay attention to. Excuse me. Number one is that the economics of compute always decrease. Right, and so compute gets faster, easier, cheaper to access, therefore there's more and more of it that's out there, therefore there's more and more innovation that comes through. Again, mirror that with the unique nature of generative AI and the fact that we have very rapidly emerging and deployed AI tools should not be a surprise to anybody. That's exactly what we would expect. And there's always a democratization of these technology capabilities. I mean, think about, 10 years ago, there was a huge, actually this was the genesis of OpenAI, right? There was a worry that one or two companies were going to control all of AI in the world, and then there was a sort of a reaction to that engendered this organization. It's exactly the opposite of what typically happens, because cost goes down, everybody can afford to play, everybody plays, and then there's more and more innovation and more access. So this was predictable as contextually. the fact that it sort of seems to have emerged from nowhere, that might be a little bit of a surprise, but from a model and a pattern perspective, it's absolutely expected that these kinds of things happen. The long tail of this that is interesting is if you take away the Chinese element of this, if you take away some of the fabrication of the economics behind it, the fact that open source is getting more and more attention is actually an interesting point. Again, entirely predictable, because this is what happens with these technology cycles, and it's just a further acceleration of the capability. But whether it's open source from company X or open source from company Y, that's been an ongoing topic for a number of years now. Incidentally, there are inherent risks within open source models that you have to be paying very careful attention to in terms of backdoors and all the other kinds of things that you would expect from cyber. But all of this fits into a pattern. The thing that AI is really changing is the speed of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very, very well said. I want to touch on the security and the supposed cost savings. Security first. A couple of days ago, a company called Wiz, that is a cybersecurity company, came out with the statement, and seemed to be enough proof that this is real, that they had been able to find and easily get into a database online that had records of almost all of the chats that users had had so far with DeepSeek. Slightly concerning, seems to be real. I'll let you find your surprised face. Any thoughts on, how quickly that was done and honestly how decisively?
In retrospect, the day that you heard of DeepSeek, you probably should have done two things. Number one was buy the dip, right? And
Yes.
Number two was send an email to everybody that you know saying, if it's not obvious to you, don't use this thing with anything personal or private or secure. Italy, of all places, immediately locked this thing down and said this is a risk to our population. We don't trust it, etc. I'm not sure if anybody else did, but I thought that was a very aggressive.
Ireland as well.
Ireland as well. So a couple of countries sort of looked at this in a very specific way. But again, none of this is a surprise to me. Before we adopt any of these kinds of emergent capabilities, we do need to go through the right kind of security, the right kind of cyber review, all of the things that we're used to doing. And it might mean that we're not looking at something like a DeepSeek model in hour one. I don't see why that's a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And Rob, I think, Ryan lists some of the due diligence, the basics that we want to do before using any tool. Would you apply those to any tool regardless of whether it comes from China or not?
Yes, I would. And my biggest concern with these models, with large language models and the generative AI, is that it will use all extant data to train. Mm-hmm. So anything that exists is training data if it can get its hands on it. Because these different models are more or less difficult to manipulate or jailbreak or trap or poison or any number of other metaphors, they have varying flavors of their own sort of internal security, but it's particularly easy to jailbreak or poison DeepSeek versus other tech. But these should all be built into the test cycle for any technology. That certainly within the CIA and NSA, the hoops that you have to go through are significant, because once it's in, and it's really difficult to get it back out. It will get access to everything, ideally. I mean, if you really want the AI to perform at its highest level, you're going to have to give it access to a lot of data, and then that puts you at risk.
Yeah, and that's a great segue into the topic of data for us. Real quick before we get there, I've been hearing from a lot of folks I know still in operational roles that they've been specifically experimenting with sandboxed versions of DeepSeek to validate these claims of cost savings. And that story is a lot more nuanced than you would think. Regardless of how much did they spend to train it, one of the selling points is that consumers will spend less on compute to use it. But that sounds like it might not be such a simple story.
For each inference that the machine is making, it's costing compute. And so you can't really bypass that. There isn't a version of this that's lean enough in terms of code that you'll be able to bypass that cost. It just is. So the cost to compute, if anything, with each inference and each transformer function, the costs are going to be attached.
Yeah.
The savings isn't there.
I would probably say our best hope there on savings is simply this, version of Moore's Law that Ryan highlighted a while ago. We're seeing almost, weekly innovations in the chips from the companies, from the NVIDIAs, from the you name them, that are leading to massive cost savings, because it's in their best interest, of course. So I think my guess is I think that's where we're going to have to pin our hopes, really, for most cost savings.
Well, I think it's going to be a combination of things. I mean, we don't need 50 companies spending $500 billion on building the next LLM. That just doesn't make sense. As I mentioned earlier, we know that it's always the case that these things become more democratized, more accessible. That doesn't mean that you need to have the full complement of absolutely everything that OpenAI has in order to optimize your SEO marketing or something like that, right? And so we've known for a long time that there were going to be basically portfolios of applications here. Some of them may run on top of the big LLM models. Some of them may be more custom. Some of them may be internal. Some of them may be whatever you like. We have to think about this as a portfolio as opposed to a monolith, right? There'll be different size applications, different energy costs, different compute costs. There will be different dynamics that go through this. This is part of why this is complex, and part of why it merits some real strategic attention, because it's absolutely not one size fits all. And again, it's just moving extraordinarily quickly. The things that we were predicting in 2024 largely came to pass. The things that we're looking at in 25 are just further acceleration, but they're actually nothing that we would have talked about in 24.
And the things you just mentioned there, Ryan, about each company's strategy, use, and deployment of AI is going to be a portfolio that suits them. I'd like to throw the same thing out there. What he said is the case for how you use the cloud, how you use, X as a service, whether it's software as a service, infrastructure as a service, platforms as a service. All of these tools are out there now, but it's never just one simple story. Fully go to the cloud and yay, enjoy the cost savings, right? Not so much, right? You need to re-architect things to work the best in the cloud. You need to make sure you're, quote, spinning up and spinning down machines so that you're not wasting compute in the cloud. Taking advantage of all of these technological innovations can lead to great cost savings for your companies, but your senior management teams and their organizations really need to understand the true story there. And I think a great opportunity for collaboration there is, that's a great collab opportunity between tech and finance, right? And that's great, because those groups must be talking together as we determine these rollout plans, strategies, et cetera, going forward. Or your balance sheet is not going to thank you in the least. We're going to move to data. How I'd like to preface this little section on data real quick is, we've been talking about it for a while. I mean, this is not new, but I'm a bit of the belief that a lot of our conversations around data over the last decade have been very much centered around risks, privacy risks of data, consent risks. Are you violating the consent you have or you don't have from your customers? How are you collecting and using your customer data, and. But an element that I believe about data that's now needing to come more to the forefront of conversation and does touch the board level is the importance of data as a currency or as a fuel for AI. We need to now be talking about that. And that's a new opportunity, number one. It's kind of exciting. But, Rob, I'll start with you on this one. How do you see some of the trends? More edge compute, more agentic AI. How does that change and maybe even enhance or redefine what data means to enterprises?
I think one of the things that's most interesting about large language models and generative AI is not just its ability to generate novel products, novel data as a result of its compute. It's also its capacity to touch all of the extant data in an organization. that you could collect both the knowledge, the wisdom, the expertise, and experience of everyone in your outfit, and harness that in a way that you've never been able to do that before. So to me, the data can feed that. And I think that goes hand in glove with the notion of the data is currency, the data is energy. It's also a product of what you produce creatively. And we talked a little bit about this last night. I think that the companies that figure out, and in my mind, the computer has gone from a tool to a team member. And we just haven't caught up to it yet as humans. That our next step is to figure out how to engage this team member. What does a human-computer team actually mean, especially in our use case? So at the NSA, for instance, the use case was we want to take away 2 hours a day or 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day of busy work. So we want our analysts to actually focus on analysis. The core function of their role is to focus on analysis. If they're filling out forms and chasing data, that's not what we want to pay them to do. Let's make our promise to our employees that we're going to make your life better by partnering you with AI rather than replacing you with AI. Principally because there are going to be core functions that you can't replace with AI. Those are the kind of use cases where I see the most opportunity now. 5 years out, the data that we collect, the more data we get from instrumentation, in the military, every soldier is a sensor. Right? You're packed with all of this technology, and you're collecting data from the environment all the time. When we embody AI in robots or industrial controls or other environments, that interaction is going to be part of their learning, their training data. And they're going to get smarter a lot faster. And I use smarter very loosely. I mean, it's just fast math. I mean, there's a lot of sleight of hand, but it's just fast math. So fast math applied to all of this new data is going to change the way that we engage with machines and technology. My 2 cents. I think I drifted. I'm sorry.
No. Your answers are great.
So computational social science means I drift. That's clear.
But in a scary way. It's a scary drift.
It's a scary drift.
It's a scary drift. Ryan, you work with a lot of companies, and you see a lot of different ways this all gets manifested. How do you see enterprises either doing, or how do you wish you would see them change in how they treat and value their data?
So I think the last part of your question is actually really important, and it's a question you can all ask yourselves. Are we actively valuing our data? Do you have a financial number associated with the enterprise's data? I would gather that most organizations don't, because you can't report it on the balance sheet, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't mean that we can't put a value on it, because if we treat it as an asset, an investable value-creating asset, then we treat it differently than if it's just a back office item. This is really simple to do. Right? You can bring this into your next board meeting and task somebody, what do we think the value of our data is, and then create a sort of ongoing capability around tracking that in terms of financial performance, growth, and the rest. Most organizations, I don't think, do that because we don't have to do that. A lot of the leading tech companies do that, even though they also can't report on it. It's just a way of changing mindset around this value-creating asset. A couple of things that I'd also comment on to follow up on what Rob was saying. Culturally, when we look at some of these new capabilities, it's very important that our organizations understand if the company is approaching this as an autonomous strategy, job displacement strategy, or an augmented strategy. And making that crystal clear in terms of the cultural messaging, et cetera, that, look, for our analysts, we want to free you up to do the really important, good work. It might sound obvious, but people are terrified of this, and for good reason, because there's a lot more, in particular, white-collar job displacement risk with this particular wave. But I'll just give you a couple of anecdotes. I've worked with a number of even public company CFOs, and within 60 to 90 minutes, we're saving them a full day's worth of work, 8 to 10 hours a week, and that's one executive, much less their entire team, and that's off-the-shelf kinds of stuff. Right, that's immediately accessible to every organization for very low amounts of money, kinds of stuff, much less when you start to ratchet up and get into the higher tiers of value creation. So there's some really interesting, easy first steps that we can do that also are secure and also don't allow the private data to go into the bigger public machine. The other thing I would say, and I might be jumping ahead with a question, but since we're on data, I'll cover it here. it's an interesting thought experiment to ask ourselves, what is going to drive equity performance over time in this new context? Yeah. Everybody has access to all of the world's public data. We all have, but now it's also in these sort of generative tools, zero additional value for any organization there. In fact, when you start thinking about the dead internet and the fact that AI is creating nonsense and blah, blah, it's getting less and less valuable over time. We all know that. So where does the differentiated value opportunity comes from? And Rob touched on one point, which is the knowledge that our people have in their heads. But it's also the unique, specific, private, secure IP and data asset that any enterprise has. So over time, using some of these algorithmic capabilities and applying it to our expertise of the last 10, 20, 30, 50, whatever number of years, that's actually what we're seeing the leading companies across sectors doing in a very masterful way. Just one example, Chip Nemo at NVIDIA, they're basically activating 30 years of chip design knowledge using their own internal generative AI tool, and that's why they're accelerating so quickly. Again, it's this reduction of marginal costs of innovation. But it's based on their own data, largely. And then they'll bring in things from outside and whatever that's helpful to complement it. But these are the kinds of new strategic frameworks that we can really be asking questions about. How do we value it? How do we activate it? And how do we translate it into some of the, again, financial performance that we're looking for?
Mm-hmm. And I'm going to ask one more question, and then I want to get to governance structures before we move into Q&A. But Rob, in your opinion, how does this change how enterprises need to think about their IP portfolio?
Well, I think we need a legal scholar, but that's a very good question. There are some problems, and I hate to do this, but I'm going to reduce this to my own use cases. So please excuse me. I'm thinking about weapon acquisition in Ukraine, and that since the war began in Ukraine over the last 3 years, weapon acquisition has changed from taking roughly 3 years to acquire a particular material to taking 30 days. And it's made that shift principally because inadvertently, because they kind of Forrest Gumped their way to it. What they decided to do was pay their frontline folks 6 times what they were paying everybody in the rear. And so their combatants actually had money in their pockets and would buy the stuff that they need off the shelf. And it reduced the acquisition cycle so much that now our government doesn't know where to put the money. I mean, we don't want to give it to their MOD because they take 3 years to produce anything. But do we want to just hand it to a bunch of combatants in the hopes that they work out a strategy together? It's a strained metaphor, I'm sorry. But the notion is that if you can introduce AI, if you can introduce these new kind of ways to think about the problem, something orthogonal to traditional acquisition, you can get these kind of gains out of your data. That requires a different way of thinking about your organization.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And again, I'll pay you $20 later because it's a great segue. The last thing I really want to make sure that we touch on before we go to Q&A, and there's some great questions that have come in already, so please keep it up. We've allocated a decent amount of time for Q&A today because we figured there'd be quite a bit. One thing that the BRC spends time on and gives you tool sets for in the book is potentially standing up new committees or altering the scope of existing committees at your board to accommodate these changes in how business is running, really. And it can take a lot of different forms. You can read a lot more about this in the book. There's also an article that Ryan wrote for NACD that's linked in the email that you got this morning that's an excellent read on the technology committee. So it can come in a lot of forms. It can be a science and technology committee. It can be a cybersecurity and technology committee. You can call it Fred as a nickname. It can be really different. It should fit what your company is. But, Ryan, you have formed one of these committees and run one yourself. You've seen them at a lot of companies. Tell our audience a little bit, what's the why here, and what do you think people need to have in mind as they think about what's right for them?
So I formed our Science and Technology Committee several years ago. I was concerned that we weren't having the forward-looking conversations that we've been talking about here. The board unanimously approved it. The CEO is on board, et cetera, et cetera. And over the last 8 or 9 years now, it's been a slow evolution. We weren't forcing anything. We had the right kind of focus and the rest. But there's a couple of really key takeaways here. One is all we did was form a committee. Management actually ran with it and were empowered to do something. But what we really did was create space for the conversation. Because as soon as you formalize this, you have to have the committee, you obviously have to have the minutes, you have to have the report back to the board. And even if it starts a little bit small, and even if people are kind of poo-pooing a little bit, you can start to get some momentum, the early wins and the rest. And the impact on the culture, the impact on the organization was absolutely spectacular, to the point that I decided to look at the Fortune 500 and see how many organizations had one of these types of committees. And I actually did the research twice. I did it in 2021 or 22, I can't remember, and 2024. And what we saw in between, about 18-month period between the first and the second analysis, was a 20% jump in these kinds of committees in the Fortune 500, similar kinds of pops in the Russell, the Russell Index and the rest. What that indicates to me is that there's just more appreciation that this is an important thing to be having, again, regular formal board discussions about. But it is an evolution. You don't need to start with big bang IP kinds of conversations. You might need to build the muscle. You might need to build the culture around it. But what we shared with the NACD article was both the deltas in financial performance, because the groups that initially had these committees were actually outperforming the indices. It's sort of a proxy for good growth and good leadership, but also a roadmap on how to do it. It's not complicated to do it, but it could be immensely powerful if you get it right.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to mention, I have, based on a lot of the recommendations and what I knew some of my fellow directors at other boards were doing, including Ryan, I was part of standing up, and I now chair a tech committee at one of my boards. And one of the sort of unexpected findings that we uncovered that's been great is it is a forum too for the emerging leadership at the company to spend time with the board. There's a lot of mid-management, sort of at that senior leadership level folks in companies that can and will benefit by some time and discussion with the board in both directions. But it's not always a good use of the full board time to do that, or maybe the right place, or maybe the right mood in the room. But the technology committee can be a great place to do that. Some of our finance and HR folks have gotten that for years via other committee structures. The tech committee is a great place to now give that opportunity to a whole area of the company personnel that's never had it before. And one thing too that I've seen, and I don't want to say that there's only one way to do this, but I hear a lot of people talk about cybersecurity and tech, and they go, oh, we need a risk committee. It's like, okay, well, those are two separate things. Your board and company may need a risk committee. You really might. Depending what vertical in, maybe it's mandatory that you have one. But, coming from 30 years in cybersecurity, we too often talk about the risks in tech and we don't talk about the opportunities. So one of the really good things about having a committee that's not solely focused on risk is that you can open up the conversation for that opportunity discussion, and you can talk about that whole spectrum of risk and opportunity together, which I think sometimes doesn't happen a lot.
And there's some real easy things that we can do. Incidentally, the Nortec's Science, Technology, and Innovation Committee charter is in the BRC. It's so you can have a look. And when we wrote that, we wrote it based on some of the other leading practices that we saw. So it's sort of an amalgamation of a number of things. But put the word innovation in the committee title. If you just call it technology committee, you do risk sort of just getting into the back office automation kinds of things. Make sure that it's appropriately referenced in the charter. Make sure that the KPIs are on this committee include new logos, new sales, new technology-driven growth, those kinds of things. And now you're actually, again, formalizing the context through which you can get this kind of regular conversation about what wins.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I'm going to go on and ask one of my own questions, and then I'm going to move into audience questions. And it's a question for each of you. Something we talk about all of the time is how can directors and boards continue their education? How do they keep learning? I'd love to hear a couple of recommendations from each of you, if there's anything particular, or even in general, that you personally would recommend to the audience that they take into account in their learning going forward.
There's an enormous amount of information out there and learning opportunities out there. And NACD, of course, through the portal and through other sort of aspects, has a lot of offerings there. I'll answer the question slightly differently to begin with, which is, I come back to what we were talking about. How do you demystify this topic? Because if you go into a board, especially a very senior group of folks who aren't technology natives necessarily, who never worked in the industry, and you start talking about subatomic particles, blah, 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 forget it, right? And you've lost them before you begin, and you've probably killed the subject for the next annual cycle. So, right? We've been there. We've all been there. And so that's not the right way to engage. There should be, again, a very concerted effort to figure out how do we engage everybody, make this accessible. What is the language and the framework and the leadership sort of lens that we want to put on this, and that's how you get people engaged. That's how you get them understanding the urgency. If you say things like, AI development cycles are going up 1,000x over a month, some people might understand what that is. Most people won't. If you start talking about margins and economic performance and financial, everybody will start to tune in and get it. So you need that kind of translation, or it's an opportunity, I should say, to consider. Beyond that, again, there's just some very simple things that you can do to show people how these tools work. Even the basic off-the-shelf level 1 kinds of stuff can drive tremendous productivity. I've seen it over and over again. And I think it's really a question of just getting started. And you'll learn your way through it. You might need to engage some people to help you along the way, but it's absolutely accessible. It's not complicated. It's just a matter of getting it started and sort of seeing it through, I would say.
How many people in here have actually used AI, generative AI? Nearly everybody, right? It's either ChatGPT or Gemini or pick one, right? Claude, whatever your personal favorite is. That hands-on is sort of a first step. I am a sucker for Notebook LM. I really like that tool, and it's because I get sent the dullest government reports that you could imagine. I mean, they're tedious. There'll be like 3 nuggets that are worth 400 pages, and there are 3 things that I took away from it. It sure is nice to reduce my workload with Notebook LM. Do I trust it all the time? No. Sometimes it comes up with just wacky stuff. But hallucinations, I think of hallucinations as a feature, right? It's not a bug. Let's see what kind of nonsense.
Kind of entertaining.
Yeah, it's fun. And then you go chase it down. Always ask for references, because that's really the differentiators, whether or not it can produce real references. So get your hands on and play with it. Sounds like everybody's doing that. Stanford, the Human AI Lab is fantastic. They put out great stuff. MIT's CSAIL puts out really good stuff. And so at Hopkins, we've got we have a lot of resources there too. The biggest issue with my students, and these are all graduate students, want to go into national security careers, when they talk about AI is they're obsessed with how it can go wrong. They're reluctant to engage it because it can go wrong. There's so many stories of people forming relationships with AI and committing suicide. Mm-hmm. There's getting catfished, and I've lost my identity. I mean, it's nothing but gloom. Mm-hmm. There are other ways to conceptualize it. It doesn't all have to be gloom. Certainly in Houston, Rice and UH are doing some interesting work. Mm-hmm. And if you're connected to ION or to TMC or to any of the innovation labs around here, those are great hands-on places too. I'm all for jumping in, but my bias is anthropology, right? Yeah. I'm out looking for the artifacts of innovation, right? I want to get my hands on them. I want to try them out and see them. That's how I like to engage. I don't know if that works for everybody, but it works for me.
And I'd like to throw in a plug. It is absolutely incredible how much free, high-quality learning there is out there now. For a long time, I mean, ever since the internet came along, there's been free learning available, but it wasn't always high quality. Specifically, go look at a recent post that Nora Denzel made that, Anna, you amplified, I think, that pointed to a couple of things on Coursera. Those are terrific courses on not just AI, but all kinds of technology. And I'd also like to say Stanford has made a lot available for free. Andrew Ng's course called AI for Everyone is excellent. And Stanford is currently running a 6-month virtual thing right now. You can search for the Rock School of Law AI and you'll find it. And they're just posting recorded virtual content that you can watch on your own. This stuff is amazing. So I'm going to move to questions. There's obviously great ones. We always get great questions in this audience. One that I want to touch on, because this is going to be very relevant to a lot of folks in our audience. As you can imagine, the energy vertical is heavily represented in here. And the energy vertical writ large is one that has a lot of legacy technology, a lot of technical debt. How do y'all recommend, either or both of y'all, feel free to give some input here, how does senior management and boards need to think about the balance of investment between making up for debt and not letting the new stuff go by?
So for a government perspective, it's the sunk cost fallacy. That we've already invested X, we can't possibly walk away from from what turns out to be a bad investment, right? And so you get places like DARPA that are set up specifically to address these issues. Here's a big pile of money, do something blue sky and crazy with it. Mm-hmm. I've seen so many government managers get stuck in this world of we've invested this much over this long, we just can't turn the corner now. Well, that never ends. Mm-hmm. At some point, somebody has to say, let's get off this page and try something different. That's hard. I mean, that's all the wisdom I have. I'm sorry. It's hard.
No, it is hard.
There's a couple of parallels, not to equate the energy sector with financial services sector, but this idea of legacy technology is very prevalent in financial services and banking in particular. There are, however, some leading banks that have taken a leadership and investment decision to not stand still on it. And when you look at what they've done and the performance through that sort of hybridization or getting out of the legacy rut, it's actually extraordinary, and you can see very quickly what the payoff period is. So I do think that there's an element of just leadership will to be modeling these things out and asking those kinds of questions and not assuming that we can't do something. Again, it's going to be case-by-case basis. More generally, I think that, again, if we come back to this idea that all of these new technologies, in particular Gen AI, have portfolio approaches, we should be looking at the cost and potential performance benefits across every functional domain in the enterprise. And we should also be looking at, and this is coming back to this idea of Gen AI being particularly powerful in innovation. Here's a big question that you can ask, and you're not going to get an answer for it on day one, but it's the kind of thing to generate the North Star. What are the biggest, most intractable problems that we have in this company and this industry? Because those are actively the kinds of solutions that we're seeing at the leading edge across different industries, be it in oncology, be it in pharmaceutical discovery, be it in investment markets, be it in any number of things, including some of the different energy fields. It's absolutely extraordinary what some of this new tech can do. And again, it's based on the private enterprise kinds of data, but we need to be experimenting with it to see what kind of benefit we can get out.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to throw Joanna's 2 cents in real quick to say senior management has to spend money on both. There's no option. You can't do one and say, oh, we'll do the other one later, right? And I would say the board's role is, as with everything, oversight of investment, right? We should make sure there's an appropriate balance in the investment the companies are doing. A great question in here from the audience is, if people are using proprietary or sandboxed AI, can they safely work with confidential information? How should people think about that spectrum of what's protected and what might get kicked out into the public?
Certainly with, I'll use CIA as an example. Getting tech into CIA it takes an effort, as you might imagine. It's when I got there, Lotus Notes was about as fancy as it got.
Still a great tool.
Still a great tool. I do love their databases. It's really hard to get that to happen. What I see as best practices to date, and certainly, and I'll talk about, and I'm sorry for the security level, but you reach a certain security level and it allows you to use top secret information in the system. To reach that, the AI instance has to be on premises. It has to be air gapped from the world. All of the retrieval augmentation comes from the actual extant data in the organization, and it's employed in use cases to start, and then where it's adding value, it grows. And so the community has sort of thought about it in the way that people might think about shared service centers. That you start with a shared service center around some function where there's a lot of transactions, and you experiment in that space first to see how it works, to see how it goes in your organization. It's hard for that to keep pace with the world. Certainly the CIA and the NSA and others think that it's the trade-off is worth it. There are certain things you don't want to happen, and imagine a Snowden every day. And that's one thing we don't want to happen.
So I think the short answer is it's entirely possible, and it's just a technology architecture design question. So you just have to do it right, and it's
That's a better answer.
a lot of groups are already doing it.
I honestly love it was a real shame that Igor could not join us today. Igor has an amazing amount of great writing out there. He's really good to read some of his articles. I specifically recommend the Total Information Mastery article that Ryan and Igor wrote together. But with that said, I think we ended up with a better complement of backgrounds up here, because both of y'all come at this from such different directions. It's really complementary. I love that. So it's going to be hard to buzz through a couple of questions because some of these are kind of meaty, but there's three at least here that I want to make sure we touch on. One of those is, great question, view on AI regulations. For a while, it looked a lot like we were sort of going to follow Europe's lead. We were kind of doing Europe light, I would say. That's clearly not really going to be the case anymore. Do you have any takeaway for the audience on how the board should thinking about AI regulation?
But it's emergent, it's complex. Europe definitely has their 2025 strategy in place for this. Under the Biden administration, there was the White House AI Bill of Rights that has been taken down from the current administration's White House website, and there's some other things, obviously Stargate among them, that are coming through. It's just very complicated. I don't have a simple answer for this one, unfortunately. I think continued diligence, but also you can expect a couple of things we know are going to be part of any regulation that has any teeth. Can you explain how the models work in as far as that's possible? Is there a person at the end of every decision? Right? You're not letting this sort of black box go without any control and without any ability, frankly, to shut it off if it starts to make problems. So there's some real basic commonalities that we see across the emergent frameworks that give us the clear swim lanes for it, albeit the details will be yet to come. I would just also comment that in certain cases it's almost like it's going too quickly. In other cases, you have industry leaders who are asking for regulation, which should tell you something about how they see the emergent competition. In other areas, in particular national security and the rest, it could be that there's opportunities for some acceleration vis-a-vis the deep seek conversation that we had before. So again, it's diligence and it's ongoing attention, and it's this one's not easy, but there's also not, unless you're operating in Europe, for example, which a lot of groups do, of course, it's a little bit nebulous right now what the rules are.
There is, I think, a way to think about it as well, which is, every board and senior management team should know what the values of their company are. And those values should match how you're deploying using AI, like everything else, right? And, it's sometimes hard to carve out that time to talk about the value conversation, right? Because we're too busy with the consent agenda. But this is probably a really good time to just do a check and say, is what we're doing and how we're doing it and who we're working with on it match who we are as a company? Not that there's one right answer.
By the way, it's not only a federal law piece. In the absence of very clear federal legislation, there's a lot of state and local laws that are already popping up that I'm sure a lot of you are already looking at. So again, there's just an inherent complexity right now.
And that is also a great point. Just like any other regulatory environment, like with data, companies will need to decide, do they want to do a differing strategy for different states and countries? Do they want to pick the toughest one and stick with that everywhere? This is just going to be questions. that y'all will need to address and decide as companies. All right, I have kind of a meaty one, but we've got 3 minutes left, so it's a challenge for y'all. But this person gave me a little money bag on text, so they get their question last. And it is a good one. It is, how in the hell and what is the board's role in establishing the AI validation and ethical frameworks, given how consequent some of the decisions AI is now making or being involved in? Congratulations, that's your last question.
Well, you don't ask the CIA guy about ethics.
This is why he's scary.
I mean, honestly, that's kind of a rookie mistake, but okay. It really is, to me, there's some fundamental questions. My concern would be the connection of AI to what is quickly becoming surveillance capitalism. This notion that we can consume public and private behavior and turn it into marketing data. I know that drives a lot of tech, drives a lot of decisions, but I also know that it strips away autonomy. And that if humans are losing their autonomy, we need to take a step back and think about it seriously. That human autonomy matters. It matters to an organization. It matters to individuals. It should be a fundamental value.
Okay.
And each of these decisions, if you are stripping autonomy away from anyone in the company, what is the value of that? What does it really cost you?
Great.
And how much is a soul? Right?
Yeah.
It's that kind of question. It's not, to me, it's not a tech question. It's a human question.
Excellent.
At one extreme, there are companies like Klarna, which have very publicly said it is our intention to reduce our workforce by half. Incidentally, a few months later, the CEO said, "Oh, that means that I can actually be replaced as well." So as you dig into these things and you start learning about it in the applications, more and more sort of becomes available to you to consider in terms of what some of the implications are. I think Joanna mentioned the idea of what are the organization's values. Obviously, this needs to align with that. You're not going to change the values because of particular technology. The balance is going to be with productivity, with looking forward, with keeping the organization as a viable enterprise, all of those kinds of things that we have to do regardless of the technology environment. But the people aspect that Rob was talking about, again, has a lot of real material business and cultural implications for the organization. Again, are we framing this as an autonomous opportunity, as an augmented opportunity? Here's an example of something that comes down the line a little bit further. If you're automating out, for example, all of the junior opportunities, we talked about this last night, how are you going to guarantee that you have managerial and expert capabilities longer term that can actually validate whether the machine is on? So we have to balance out a lot of these different things. I think as you dig in, first of all, there's all kinds of white papers and guidance and things that you can review on this. I wouldn't suggest that it's overly complicated to get an initial framework together, and then you just have to keep evolving as the tech continues to grow.
Yeah. One great thing, and I think it's a great thing to leave us with, and before I hand it over to Darnell, is right now keep a human in the loop. You can decide where that human is, but we're seeing the best and most reliable outcomes from human and AI together. And I think that's a great note to end on. So, Darnell?
Thank you very much.